So anyway, second meeting. This time we've got another 3 readings, much shorter. Since you're the one who suggested them, do you want to go ahead and do the opening, AI?
Sure. This week, we decided to read the words of Anders Sandberg in Morphological Freedom, Why We Not Just Want It, But Need It, Eliza Yudkowsky in Transhumanism Simplified, and my words to Victor Frankenstein about the village of Chamonix, Performing Transgender Rage by Susan Stryker. These 3 were chosen specifically to provide contrast to each other. Anders Sandberg sort of represents the neutral transhumanist perspective, and Eliza Yudkowsky the libertarian perspective, and very much more so the singularitarian cult perspective, shall we say. Since that's very much the rabbit hole he fell down. Meanwhile, Susan Stryker represents specifically in humanism, and is the philosophy that I don't think she coined it in this. I think that was someone else, but she specifically called out as what her essay is about in said essay. But it's also more representative of the anarcho-transhumanist side of things.
To be clear, I don't think Stryker identified herself as an anarcho-transhumanist, but
It is not.
there are similar strands of thought between her writing and trans writings, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That was one of my sort of goals is to sort of get in each session as much as possible, sort of a broad overview of each of the 3 to 5, depending on how you count them, different political tendencies of transhumanism. You have like democratic transhumanism, which is also progressive transhumanism, which is basically sort of what sort of like anarcho-transhumanism, but they don't actually incorporate anarchist thought. Where anarcho-transhumanists say we need to dismantle, the structures that cause particular issues, where that's a whole laundry list. Democratic transitions take a more progressivist stance of let's reform and fix what's there rather than trying to dismantle everything. There's probably more that can be said, but we won't actually be getting into that until we actually crack open books on the explicit tendency of democratic transhumanism. And the libertarian one, there's 3 schools of thought, just libertarian, and then you have the extropians and the singularitarian. And we'll be getting to those later. But anyways, for now, let's get on to the essays themselves. Which one do we want to start off with?
Well, let's save the best for last, and I guess start with Yudkowsky.
The word first.
Yeah. So, honestly, first thoughts on the Yudkowsky article was that it was very facile. It felt...
Okay, you can say it's stupid.
Yeah.
It wasn't stupid, it was just bad. Like, I think stupid kind of undersells it. Like, it was actively manipulative. Like, what really blew me away was the first part when he's like, yeah, you totally don't need to think about this. Like, please do not think about what I'm saying. Please, just follow the instinct, the things that at first blush, you support. Like, he literally gives license basically not to actually have to think about anything that he says and just like accept it at face value. Like, it's like it's kind of culty would be the way that I would kind of describe it. Yeah.
I would say that it really relies on a world of unlimited resources. It's the idea that it's not, the problem is not that it's culty. It is, but that in a world where the limitations of skills, of manpower, of resources do not apply, then yes, you want to ensure anti-aging. Options are available. Yes, you want to, help people be the best that they can be. The problem is, we don't live in that world,
Well,
and
See,
we probably never will.
well, I think the big part of the problem is that with this essay and with understanding it is that you need to really understand the whole thesis of Yudkowsky, which is how the singularity will change the world so dramatically that everything else will not apply. So it's basically nerd rapture, if you will. And if you read this essay alone, then you can say it's okay in a sense because it's incomplete. So it has a lot of missing parts. But if you read Yudkowsky as a whole, then you've got a slew of big fundamental problems. Like, this is the least offensive part of his work.
Oh, certainly.
I've posted on the thread on the forum a bunch of resources, and this essay, it really doesn't scratch the surface of what Yudkowsky writes about.
Yeah. Honestly, we could probably read Near Reaction of Basilisk for a lot of the opinions of Moldbug, Yudkowsky, and Neil Land, rather than trying to dive deep into their works individually and kind of getting lost in it all.
I don't really want to focus too much upon the neo-reactionary tendency because while that's related to transhumanist thought, it's not really transhumanist thought in and of itself.
I wouldn't say Yudkowsky can be put in the same boat as Land, though, New Land, because he's sort of an utopian idealist in a sense. I mean, he believes in a lot of stupid stuff, but it's very different from what Land thinks. So Yudkowsky is not a reactionary. He's just someone who is very, I don't know, disconnected or has a very stupid idea of what intelligence means.
He's an intelligence cultist. He's somebody who takes some ideas that are obsolescent, some ideas that don't work, and some ideas that are genuinely coming from good places, mashes them all together and slathers it in a great big heaping pile of weirdness.
I think the thing with
just believe me.
I think the thing with Yudkowsky. Sorry, you first.
No, please go on.
I think the thing with Yudkowsky is you kind of have to, in order to understand Yudkowsky, you also have to understand the cultural milieu of early 2000s, late 90s science fiction. Because a lot of that is kind of where when you read Yudkowsky, you can see a lot of that kind of politics in there. Obviously it's stuff like the culture books, and Werner Ving and stuff like that. But also, the kind of desire to both have meaningful philosophy, but also not actually do any work for it and kind of ignore what had gone before. That was a very sort of 90s, the idea that what is old was going to vanish and was unnecessary, and that we would basically, I think that from the end of history and the problems of the end of history, especially in the 90s, you kind of had a sort of very ahistorical rebellion. And that's a thing that was very integrated into the work of the time, right? So, and that I think is where you get Yudkowsky's stuff of where he kind of comes from with this you can instinctively judge morality, and smarter is better and lifer is better, and none of this has any problems, and we never have to judge which is more important than the other, and we never have to come up to a surprising conclusion. And also, like, transhumanism is never going to do anything scary, and that comes from that kind of moment where the end of history is clearly failing, but at the same time, there's not the kind of connection that I feel there is today with, like, past struggle, right? Because the thing is, like, the basic, like, the reintroduction of, like, Sanders and Corbyn to a certain extent, and other figures on the left, have basically meant that people have, like, reconnected with the struggle that is, like, reconnected with philosophy to a certain extent. Like, you've now got a connection between, like, what you're doing now and what happened in 1919 or whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, there's one thing about what you said that I kind of disagree with, and that's with the idea that Yutkowski doesn't think that anything can go wrong. He's actually incredibly paranoid about AI.
No, that's true.
And about how intelligence without human direction can evolve. And you know why? It's some of his best work, and it's also some of his worst work, because it combines some interesting idea with an utter lack of understanding of what intelligence is. So his thesis is that AI, in no matter what circumstances, will take over the world in weeks. Period.
Yeah, it's stupid.
Which is interesting to put it.
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting contradiction between the argument Yutkowski puts out here, which is essentially that you don't need to think, that trying to come up with cases where the general rules don't apply is bad, and that it's a sign of trying to be an intellectual rock star or whatever it is. And then his thought where he actually goes and does that himself, tries to find the edge cases of AI, tries to figure out where it's not going to fit with our naive presuppositions. So I find it interesting that he both seems to believe what he says here, that you really shouldn't try to have edge cases, that you need to, as Alice said in the comments, if there were exceptions, it wouldn't be elegant, so just don't have any exceptions. You need to have a perfect, universal, valid philosophy. And his actual, perhaps slightly more interesting work on AI research, where that is just cast aside, and he actually does try to come up with all of these things that he just said were bad and shouldn't be focused on. I don't know, I think that's kind of an interesting sort of back and forth there, potentially, but I'm not sure to what extent we should really focus on that, as opposed to focusing on the comparing and contrasting between Yud's work here and the other two essays we've got.
So on the note of comparing and contrasting, I said this in text chat already, but I'll bring it up again. I find it interesting that this is the collectivist argument we have this week, because we haven't had one of those yet. And while Yud is, I think, generally very libertarian, and there's a lot of that focus on the individual, it is trying to be a universal moral principle. It is a community and society-wide call to action, right? It's not just that you yourself should have a longer life and should be allowed that, and are morally justified in wanting to live longer, be smarter, or augment yourself. Yud is implicitly and very directly saying that you have to do this for other people. You have to save people from death. If you see someone who has lower IQ, you have to fix it, right? It is a moral imperative that you fix it, and asking about consent or whether they want it or whether their cultural system accepts this or whether their society does or any of these other things. Those are inelegant questions that you should be ashamed of for even asking, or that you would be foolish for even worrying about. It's almost very centralized. I don't know, in a weird way I associate with some collectivist things. Like this very strong dismissal.
I would call it a bottom-up collectivist ideology. It's not something which saying, it's not trying to fix the big problem. Rather, it's saying you have to fix the problems in your sphere, and doesn't try and engage with this question of, if I fix the problems in my sphere, and all of you are fixing your problems in your own spheres, what does that mean for everybody?
Well, I think he views this, looking at his other works once again, is that I think he views this as universally enriching. Like, I think he views this as unambiguously positive in every single circumstance, compared to the alternative at least. And I think this is one of his more interesting arguments, like the fact that improving from the bottom up will improve, the tide will rise and carry all the boats with it, so to speak. So that's sort of a collectivist argument, and I think that's sort of an interesting argument. I think that's one of the better arguments he makes.
The thing that the rising tide raises all boats is effectively a lie. It's a lie told by an elite who wants the rising tide to raise their boats and wants to convince gullible fools to go along with it.
Well, I mean, I don't think that's true, in the sense that a rising tide lifts all boats is true. The question is not whether it's true. The question is whether it's good enough, right? So obviously, it is true in the sense that standard of living over the past 150 years for people in North America, for example, has dramatically increased. A rising tide has lifted all boats. Even the poorest people are better off than they would have been 500 years ago in the same socioeconomic status. The question is not whether that's true. The question is whether we should do better than that, right? Whether that is adequate. So you look at Reaganism, we don't need to do any more for poor people because a rising tide will lift all boats. As opposed to a scenario where you say, it may be true that a rising tide will lift all boats, but we need to do more for the people at the bottom.
Well, you could look at the rate of how much it lifts.
Well, yes,
the rich get richer faster, right?
The relative position in the movement, in the left, it's very important. But I don't think that Yudkowsky is very concerned with this. I mean, I think he's coming from the position where upward movement is good, and if the upward movement is universal, which he is very certain and very convinced that it's going to be universal, like that's one of his main thesis. Insofar as he has a coherent thesis, which isn't just paranoia or just wanting to have a cult.
So I think
he's just a moment so I can finish. He just wants the numbers to go up, basically. And it's very simple, but it's also very lackluster in a way.
And I think one of the interesting things is, and this is perhaps more relevant to Sandberg, but I think it's also true here, is that you get a Heather Bradshaw's paper on morphological freedom, I think sort of touches on this problem, when it basically says that humans, we think we can imagine what we would be like if we were different, but we do a bad job of it. Right? There are a number of studies which she cites, which basically say people think they can understand what it is like to be smarter, or what it is like to be blind, or what it is like to be older, or whatever, right? They think they can imagine that, but they're wrong. if we combine people who have lower IQ with people who have higher IQ, they don't imagine themselves correctly, right? They don't imagine what that is actually like. If we imagine people who are young, we take people who are younger, we ask them to imagine what it's like to be older. They don't do that very well. Like they don't get it right. And in fact, there is the differences in life experience and in what it means to live are quite different than what people expect they mean. And I think that is really relevant here because you get somebody like Yudkowsky whose argument is basically, let's just make the IQ go up. It's just a number. Let's just make it go up. Life is just a number. Let's just make that go up. Nothing will be different. We'll just be smarter. We'll just be older. It'll just be better. We'll be happier. But Bradshaw, I think, makes a convincing argument that's probably not true. That this idea that if we just extended everybody now lives to 500 years old instead of 80 years old or whatever, it's not just going to be the same people who are older. That there is likely to be a substantial difference, and we don't know what that difference is. And that it is very difficult, therefore, to talk about the value of life extension, the value of age extension, the value of IQ increasing, the value of all of these things without, like, how can people provide their informed consent to something they have absolutely no understanding of? And they have no understanding of the consequences of.
Yeah.
He doesn't address this at all. And a lot of people, and the Morphological Freedom paper also does not really address this at all. But Bradshaw makes this ethical argument, which basically goes, there are serious ethical concerns with this idea that we're going to change people without understanding what that change will lead to. Now, you could make an argument, perhaps, as Chanel says, right? You could, or at least I read Chanel as saying, you could make an argument that maybe we can just discard that concern. We can analyze that issue, and we can say we don't think it's a big deal. But Yudkowsky doesn't really seem to address that at all. That's not even...
Yudkowsky's ignoring a lot of things here. Like, it's not even, I called it smuggling in earlier, but I'm not even sure that's true. I don't know if Yudkowsky has thought of this.
Yeah, probably true.
I don't think he really thought about this at all. Like, he doesn't seem to have considered any of these problems. I don't think he's really considered the sociological impact of anything other than AI going crazy and turning the Earth into paper clips, basically.
Isn't that the whole point of this essay? That you don't have to consider these things, that they're just trivially going to end up acting for the better because you have the obvious answer is just correct.
Well, the obvious answer is only correct when it agrees with him.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you need to reason through things and get to his answer.
Yeah, that was actually a point I kind of made in the thread of all things, where I was talking about how I actually applied the sort of common sense reason because I, as a scientist by training, look at this basic argument of, hey, a lot of stuff is actually obvious. We shouldn't discard it just because it's obvious. Not everything has to be a surprising answer. Sometimes, yes, you will have surprising answers, which is not something Yudkowsky admits is a valid or informative point. In fact, he kind of smugly dismisses it. But when you have a surprising answer, it's worthwhile to do that instinctive, intuitive first pass guess. Does this look right? And if not, well, you sit there and analyze it. Did you get the math right to get your conclusion? Are you taking into account everything? Is there anything you missed? Or do you need to potentially discard the framework entirely? And I pointed out this exact problem where he basically, in a different article of his, where he's bitching about how exponential decay is superior to how humans prioritize short-term thinking. But that's only true in very idealized circumstances where, you know, you can predict that something, you know, basically you will have an infinite amount of time to take advantage of this. A lot of people forget that, you know, poor people, when they do these tests and go, oh, humans hyperbolically discount. This is bad because it's not ideal to ideal circumstances. Yeah, most poor people, they're the ones who are going, well, I can have something now, or I can trust this asshole when I have zero experience of authority figures actually being trustworthy. I can trust this asshole to pay me later 100 times as much, potentially past when I need the money.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly insightful critique of the idea that you can just make the quote-unquote rational decision at all times, or that rather the rational decision is rational in all cases and
Yeah.
under all circumstances for all people.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to consider things in terms of a rational outlook, obviously your decision is going to change based on your circumstances. I'm not sure that's something that's really addressed within Yudkowsky's framework, as you just explained. That said, I would like.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
It's addressed, but it's addressed poorly.
I think the
I
problem
feel
with
the other
Yudkowsky.
thing.
Go on.
Sorry. I think the other problem with Yudkowsky is, like, what I thought was so fascinating about that paper, considering, you know, some of the other stuff that I mean, I'm not a Yudkowsky scholar, but like considering some of the other stuff he's done, I think it's kind of interesting how small are Yudkowsky's ambitions. Like, really, his ambition, like when he like states the case for transhumanism in this paper, he basically is like, okay, so we're basically gonna be the same. We're just gonna live longer, and we're gonna be smarter as judged by IQ. And even if you discount the IQ thing, you know, and say, okay, you know, like IQ does not exist, blah blah, you know, we'll just become more intelligent. But like, what if I don't just want to be like, what if I don't want to be more intelligent? What if I want to think in a different way? What if I don't just want to live longer, but I want to become a swarm of razor-edged butterflies, right? You know, like how small your messianic ambitions are, Kowski, that you only think that what we're going to do in transhumanism is just make a better version of like 1999. And
Well,
I think that is. Sorry, you first.
No, go ahead. You seemed like you were. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting example of thought at the time. Like, I think to a certain extent, Yudkowsky is a bit of a lungfish or sort of like a shark, maybe. Like, he's a sort of a bit of a living fossil in a way, because thing is, in 1999, everything was great, right? And that's, I think, where a lot of the kind of Yudkowsky thing comes from, early 2000s media. And I don't think that they're like. I think to a certain extent. I'm not sure where I'm going with this now.
I would approach it from a totally different angle. I think I know where you're coming from, but I would approach it from I think he is coming from the Fukuyama angle. So
yes.
what you are seeing with Yudkowsky is basically Yudkowsky is a victim of the end of history. He sees the future as essentially being a public choice utopia. And in a public choice utopia, in an end of history utopia, nothing needs to change. People don't change. People, like, yeah, you could be smarter, you can live longer, you can be more rational, but rationalization in this sense only means essentially becoming Homo economicus, right? It is that sort of really drilled down existentialist version of the Fukuyama, the Brennan, the public choice theory, end of history, sort of not post-capitalist, but like social democratic capitalism, or however you want to.
Neoliberal.
Yeah, fine. Yeah, neoliberalism. Basically, there is this idea that people will always be like that, right? That is what people are like, and making them smarter is just going to make them happier because they won't be different. They'll just be like faster at writing essays or whatever, right? They'll be more productive, but they'll do exactly the same thing they were doing before.
Yeah,
I
I
think
think that a lot of it is the Silicon Valley bent. You know, I mean, he's not, because Fukuyama is very much concerned about society and politics, and I think Yudkowsky is very much concerned about the Silicon Valley, the technological innovations, but very much surface stuff, so not fundamental.
I don't think those things, and I know where you're coming from, but I don't think those two things can be as easily untangled as that. And I think, in particular, one of the things that you see, or at least I see anyway, is this idea that the Silicon Valley mindset, in many ways, is essentially established as the Fukuyama-esque politics version, right? So Fukuyama, you're right in the sense that Fukuyama is talking about politics, but Fukuyama's politics are basically like liberal democracy and free market capitalism is the end point of humanity's evolution. That is what society will be. That is the best society can be. And Silicon Valley technopolitics is basically liberal democracy and free market capitalism will lead us to the promised land of sort of end state techno-capitalism, right? So you get this idea that big mega corporations should be allowed to do whatever they want, however they want. Users can choose. Users will vote with their feet. Big corporations are not restricted by the government, and you get those two things. I think really build on each other. And so when Yudkowsky, who is a victim of Southern California, when Yudkowsky is developing his idea of politics, it's basically exactly that, right? It is that end of history based politics.
Yeah,
Well, and the thing is,
sorry.
At least it's that when it's not the geek rapture.
Yeah,
it is the geek rapture. That's the thing. The geek rapture is based on the end of history.
And
right?
The distinction I wanted to make between Fukuyama and Yudkowsky is much smaller than that. In that, basically, Fukuyama is thinking more about Washington politics and about Wall Street economics, and Yudkowsky is very much focused on a specific Silicon Valley interpretation. But they're basically the same school with a bit of variance.
I think the thing is, taking actually what you said, Gravitas Free Zone. I think it's also to a certain extent, Yudkowsky's work is also kind of correcting for the it's also kind of looking towards the sort of failure of Fukuyamian thought, because by the time Yudkowsky started really going hard in the aughts, right, it was pretty clear the history was starting to show its age, right? It didn't really die until 2008, but you could still already sort of see the cracks. And I think to a certain extent that what you see with Yudkowsky is kind of and actually a lot of Yudkowsky's contemporaries, to a certain extent, I mean, although I like Cory Doctorow a lot more, you kind of see this in the works of Cory Doctorow a bit as well, that you can see that there are cracks in the end of history, but what you're trying to do to paper them over is basically use Silicon Valley organizational trickery and tech, right? So it's you kind of get the acceptance that maybe this whole end of history doesn't, isn't very good in a lot of respects, because Russia has blown up and 9/11 has happened and so on and so forth. But at the same time, you don't really have any kind of real attempt to replace it. What you're trying to do is go beyond it by saying, okay, let's everybody, let's stick brain implants into everybody so they can produce better and they make smarter decisions. Let's, gamify things, right? So if we use the techniques of, yeah, exactly, right? 9/11 killed it in its original form, but there still wasn't really a replacement. So what you get is this sort of, we'll reorganize society, if Fukuyama is the representative of like the East Coast, like economic, is a victim of the East Coast, well then Yudkowsky and the people who like tried to take the end of history forward are victims of the West Coast, right? They're trying to push this kind of like Silicon Valley, like organizational process kind of model. Like I remember reading that one story of his. Did you guys read the thing with the like super happies and the like aliens
Oh,
who?
God, that's so fucking stupid.
God, that thing. Yeah.
I am
Yeah.
unfortunately deeply behind on my Yudkowsky.
Yeah, well, he wrote this story, and the actual thing of it doesn't really matter. But the way the humans make decisions in that is they basically have like a decision make like basically a predictive market. Yeah, that is pretty interesting. Like, because that's the thing. Like, Fukuyama is actually incredibly scared of posthumanism.
Although
Sorry,
I would suggest that Fukuyama's version of posthumanism is not that different from Yudkowsky's, right?
No.
So what Fukuyama is afraid of is this idea of essentially human divergence, right? I think if you read Fukuyama's book on the posthuman future, what he is afraid of is this idea that we will have like a flowering of humanity that escapes from the end of history, basically, is probably the best way to put it.
Yeah,
and
but
so
I think, yeah.
so
Sorry.
Fukuyama sees humanity's future, his post-human future, what he imagines as a good post-human future, is where everybody is still exactly the same but smarter.
Yeah, but
right?
I think the difference between Fukuyama and Yudkowsky is that Fukuyama understands the idea that growth and change aren't simply going to be linear. It simply isn't going to be numbers grow up. There's going to be divergence. There's going to be a lot of risks and transformations involved. And
and that's what he's worried about, right?
And I don't think Yudkowsky really understands that. Like, I don't think that he deep down really considers the fact that smart people may be different than him.
Oh, it's weird because I think he does, but only with AI, right? That's the Yudkowsky thing, is imagining. You can imagine an evil AI getting like out of control, but he can't imagine that happening with people.
Exactly, and like he's got a lot of weird hang-ups, like like the fact that he hates people with. I don't think he hates, but he sort of disdains PhDs. And he's basically extremely. I don't know. He views intelligence as like a mountain with himself on a peak. It's a very unempathetic way of looking at things. That's what I'm trying to get, because he's basically he doesn't imagine that fact that someone can diverge from his dogma in any way.
Yeah, if you're smarter, you would just agree with Yudkowsky. His is the natural endpoint, and you would get there anyway if you thought about it. So you might as well hurry on and get there.
Right. Whereas somebody like Fukuyama is essentially terrified that without control, you're just going to see people like running off in every direction, and then they'll be like post-human cyborgs running around killing people. Like
like blind sight vampires on one side and like superhuman trans women on the other.
Yeah, and so you get Fukuyama's like, no, we don't want any of that. Bad time.
Everyone has to stay like this, and we're just going to end human history and knowledge. It's very
Let's get back
that
sounds awesome.
Yeah. So I do think we spent a lot of time on Yudkowsky at this point.
Yeah, we should move on to morphological freedom, probably. But
yeah.
I really want to hear what you guys have to say about morphological freedom. Actually, sorry, Karen.
Yeah. Okay. So step back to something that was said earlier about Yudkowsky, which is, I think, a good point to lead into morphological freedom from. Alex, I think, said that Yudkowsky basically posits a sort of moral obligation to engage in, how do I put this? Basically, transhumanist ascension of people to you are obligated to give this person a better IQ. The question of whether IQ is a meaningful measure, let's just leave aside for now. you are obligated to give this person who is on the train tracks away from the train tracks. I'd assume if he encountered someone with a disability, someone who was blind or deaf, he would say, well, you are morally obligated to make them not blind or deaf, because that is the very simple, straightforward answer, which he would assume is absolutely philosophically correct. Sandberg seems to come at things from a different angle. He basically takes the disability advocate perspective to some degree, though I don't think he really explores it very well. I don't. I'm curious. I'm curious as to what extent he actually is familiar with disability advocacy. How many he knows, how many he's talked to, informing this sort of perspective on morphological freedom. But yeah, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm agreeing, basically. Also, I do think that he hasn't really thought about it deeply, because there's this line, there seems to be a natural point of agreement between transhumanists and the disability movement, which might prove fruitful in future debate. It's very much positioned as a, well, this sounds like it would make sense, but I haven't actually looked kind of thing.
Yeah, I would like to point out it's very interesting, the framework. Alice, you pointed out that Yudkowsky very much frames it as this collectivist call to action, but Sandberg actually frames it in this liberal humanist framework of human rights, and sort of building off of these deontological principles in a way that harkens back all the way back to like people like John Stuart Mill.
Yeah, it did remind me much of the classical positive and negative liberty thing. Very much that sort of individualist viewpoint.
He even calls morphological freedom a negative right.
Yeah.
Yeah, like he's very explicit in drawing from those roots, because he's
Yeah, but he does it badly. That like.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough,
know exactly what you mean
but he
there,
does it, but he does it clearly enough that I don't really view this as so much as a stylistical problem, because he's clearly drawing and making the same arguments, except he's extrapolating it to transhumanism and morphological freedom, to be more precise.
I don't agree with that, and the reason I don't agree with that is because what I think you can find, and what critiques of Sandberg's paper will suggest, and there are several of them. Apparently, he's actually been cited in like reputable journals for people who have been very aggressively unhappy with his work. But a lot of those critiques basically say you can't just talk about negative rights and just sort of like throw it out there and be like, all right, this is a negative right, we're going to move on. Because a lot of the underlying work that has gone into the idea of negative rights and positive rights more recently, stuff like Hofeld, stuff like Israel Berlin, talks about the interconnection between negative rights and positive rights, right? And there is a lot of work that goes into the cross corollaries of rights, and specifically in the disability context, what that means. And he's just sort of like zoomed right past that work.
I felt his whole discussion on rights really needed to be a lot longer. Like when I read it, actually, that was one of the most things that kind of like off-put it. One of the most off-putting things to it, because like I literally almost got. It really took some willpower to not just like open my PDF and actually just like put a thing on it that said like, and put like a big Wikipedia who on when he, or like cite, what exactly do you mean by rights-based morality? Like whose rights-based, whose work are you citing here? What do they say on what is the basic description of the morality you're using? Because that was, I think, the thing that really kind of cost the essay, is it kind of hangs in the air, right? Like it says, okay, well, I think that this is mostly written from rights-based morality, and I think it agrees with other morality too. But I'm not really going to tell you what rights-based morality means, and I'm not really going to talk about why it might agree with other morality. So, that felt to me very lacking.
Rights-based morality is basically Calvin Ball.
yeah.
So there's a lot of I don't want to say doublethink, but sort of holding these different ideas up and then quickly like moving on. So especially like the morphological freedom and society passage, where it says, okay, this isn't an atomic thing, even though up till now we've talked about this mostly as an individual right and in a very explicitly kind of libertarian framework. But now we're going to talk about how society comes into it. And then nothing really comes from that. It says we need a society that upholds it because it can't just be a theoretical right. So you need the society has to let you, there aren't any resources available, but it never really gets to the point of asking what that looks like or is. It just says that society should have a lot of tolerance and it should encourage diversity. And okay, cool. But, how? And in what ways? What does this look like?
Well,
Well, I think he
answer
looks at
would
modern
be-
society.
would be
And
such a liberal society as it is today.
yeah, well, I think he looks at modern society and simply views morphological freedoms as an extrapolation of existing right and existing humanist thought. Like, I don't think he's really considered or really. I mean, I know he's considered it in other works, but I don't think he's really putting out this manifesto for a future society, more like today's society or 2030s, 2040s. Like, I don't think he's viewing this as something that's going to be applicable, or I don't know, like a problem for the far future. Like, I think he's viewing this as a call for action now, rather than.
Quick question on this one. When was this actually published? Because all the sites are from like the late 90s, 99, 98.
I want to say this was published in 2001.
Okay, that would make more sense.
I'm not sure if this was originally a paper or if this was like a speech he did that was converted into a paper.
From what it sounds like this is originally speech.
Yeah, because this okay, so I don't know how many of y'all have done public speaking, but a lot of the flaws that have been pointed out are very endemic to public speaking because basically when you're doing public speaking, you sort of need to get your point across quickly, and you need to use rhetorical tricks to highlight your point, but you can't really go into depth in the same way that you could with an essay. So, I mean, you could, but it would very quickly alienate a lot of the people who are listening because the whole point is mass participation, mass attention. So, yeah, it's something I learned at university. I'm sure Squishy had folks talk to him about that university level stuff too. Because it's one of the differences in the medium of communication rather than just the just the content.
I think the big problem that I had with the morphological freedom one, because like I mean, obviously I'm pretty much in favor of morphological freedom, but I actually felt that this one gave a pretty bad account of it. Like I know Squishy's got criticisms on this as well, but like like I felt like it didn't really it kind of like just treated it as if like, oh, okay, so we've established morphological freedom is good, and no one is actually going to disagree with me that morphological freedom is good. So we can just go on. We can just go on and say it's like we can just go on and say like here morphological freedom, it's good. Here's 2,000 words or whatever it is.
If you're worried about class differences, don't worry. Things will get cheaper, and so class differences will never happen, and we don't need to think about that anymore. Moving on.
Yeah, exactly. Like, because, like, what if on a societal level you now have people with like violently different capacities? Some people are like D&D dragons who are also like super geniuses, and some people are just like normal humans. Or like, what if I become like a super intelligent razor butterfly with like 3 personalities, which are all good at different things, and I can turn myself into a blindsight vampire at will and just like pilot it around and stuff like that. Like, like that kind of stuff is like, as much as it might be cool to do, that kind of stuff would be a real problem for society, right? Because you suddenly created a situation where you know,
Well,
people
just
are going
consider
to
adding an extra sentence, how that would change society if, like, 60% of people have an extra sentence. Then the other 40% of people are essentially running around blind or deaf.
Exactly right. You know, like these are things which are going to have an enormous societal impact, and you know, it's questionable whether you can just. At least to me, it's rather questionable whether you could even really even use the framework of rights to deal with them, because like. Yeah, exactly. Like as Miss Bond says, like if you're adding an extra cent, well, you know, like. Are we going to compel people to have it? Are we going to say we don't want people to have it? You know, like we're going to actually have to design our, you know, like you're going to have to design your society.
Well, I think this goes back to Bradshaw's particular criticism of. Okay.
What is happening?
Sounds like someone just popped in and they've got some.
Golden Archangel, can you mute yourself if you're not, unless you're, thank you.
So, okay. What I was going to say is, I think that Bradshaw makes a very specific criticism of Sandberg's paper, or Sandberg's argument, and basically says, the idea of morphological freedom needs to be contrasted with this idea of what that means for people who choose not to enhance themselves, right? So exactly that. What does that mean for people who choose not to enhance themselves? And the example Bradshaw uses, which I think is interesting, is life extension, right? And Bradshaw basically goes, the idea that everybody wants to have their life extended is actually an assumption without a lot of evidence behind it. And even when we talk about something that is so, at least superficially, sort of a consistent value, right, we need to talk about what that means in practice. Because if we end up having some people who have really, really long lives and some people who don't have really long lives, what is the social consequence of doing that? And what does that practically mean for society? And we need to evaluate that moral context when we talk about what rights mean, when we talk about what the consequences of rights are and how they can be used. Because when we talk about rights, there's always sort of a concomitant obligation that goes with those rights. So, and that's the Hofeldian thing. So if you have a right to extend your life, that implies nobody has the right to prohibit you from extending your life, right? And what does that mean for the people who choose not to do it?
It is a very weird thing that Sandberg says that part of valuing diversity is that you value like conservatives, and you know, very 2001, I guess.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
I think. Go ahead.
Sorry. So I'm kind of interested in kind of where Sandberg is. So he does draw on this example of kind of that I think is actually one of his stronger points on some levels, but still needs a certain amount of critique, that you might want to account for people who say could have a limb restored but don't want it, who do like choose not to get this particular technology that we tend to think of as an axiomatic good, and that people might reject that. So he does kind of touch on this element, but I'm kind of curious how he bound this concept of morphological freedom at all, really. In that, for example, he makes, I think, a fairly compelling case that you shouldn't be forcing people to get a cybernetic arm. But I wonder kind of where he stands on, say, if you decide you want to cut off your arm. As a certain number of people in the real world do. Just have a certain fixation on, like, removing limbs, or that kind of thing. Is Sandberg entirely okay with this? Do we define this as kind of a mental health issue and therefore exempt from morphological freedom, even though the framework creates an argument that that person can use to basically say, no, this is my choice for my body? And then similarly, what about things like certain drugs? Like if there's a drug like cocaine that modifies you in a certain way but has extremely deleterious health consequences.
Right. Do you have a right to different states of mind? Which I think Sandberg actually does say somewhere in here.
But
Well,
then is that right unbounded, or is like, do you have a right to destroy yourself?
Well, I think
Kind of,
Okay. He does frame it as a negative.
Well, that's something we already deal with.
So, he explicitly says he's only talking about the general case. So the idea that specific mental states are bad, or you can't give yourself a nuclear bomb in place of a heart, those things are sort of left as an aside. It's arguing for that general case because those things can be ruled against in specific on other grounds.
So I guess, like, where is he on the law of double effect? Because if you have the right to not have a limb restored, do you have a right to create that disability?
I mean, I think that. Sorry.
I think we can actually bring this back to a more pressing issue in our current, I guess, world. Do you have a right to refuse vaccination?
Right.
I think that would also have other rights mixed in it, because vaccination is more about how you protect society than how you protect yourself.
I mean, isn't that the core issue in any event, right?
I'm not sure for most anyone that like being vaccinated changes your self schema in some way or alters your concept of your body or constitutes that kind of change.
Well, a lot of anti-vaxxers do think it does. They're wrong, but they do think it does. They think it's going to change your DNA or something.
Yeah.
I mean,
also,
I mean, for instance, I mean, I think also like having sort of anti-vax adjacent parents. I mean, they're not actually anti-vax, but like I think they would probably move in those circles if I hadn't yelled at them a couple of times. But like what if you don't want it just because you think it's bad for you, right? Like, and what if it like how do you on a social level like assess that, right? Because I mean, it's not like medicine has like we are privileged to live in an age when medicine is relatively safe, right? But that has not always been the case. Like a lot of the whole like anti-vax thing is really based on like people remembering when they were like randomly spraying people with x-rays and shit, right? So what do we think that that's okay? And also, what about people who can't consent, right? Like if you like, for instance, I was thinking as you were talking about this, Shadell, what about the whole debate over like deaf children, right? And whether or not you should give them, like, whether or not they should be like automatically given those implants that allow hearing. Because there are a lot of deaf rights activists who say, like, no, this is a complete, like, this is actually like forcing someone to hear is a total violation of their okay. Yeah, it's a total violation of their freedom. So
I would frame it as a form of cultural genocide.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Sandberg says something about this a little bit, which says that even if they couldn't force people to be cured of expensive lifestyle disabilities or whatever, that governments would shame them passively or set up incentives against them, and that this is something we should prevent. So the status quo where that happens is very much something Sandberg is complaining about.
The problem, I think, is that Sandberg doesn't really address that issue in any meaningful way. Like, he complains about the status quo, but you can sort of very quickly see a whole variety of examples. So, and one of the things is that we as society impose costs on the rest of society as a way to make up for disabilities in many circumstances, right?
Well, he does talk about that a little bit.
Well, he does talk about it, but he doesn't address the issue, right? He doesn't talk about what the resolution of this issue is. So, and I gave an example that in the chat. So suppose that we say, okay, morphological freedom is we don't need, it's an attack on human dignity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you're deaf, you don't have to fix that. But to what extent does that require society to go along with your choice? Is society required to provide ASL interpreters, for example, right? It's one thing to say it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to ban society from shaming people who are quote unquote unenhanced, disabled, whatever, right? Fine. Okay. But do we need the Americans with Disabilities Act or your local equivalent if that's the case, right? Do we need to have wheelchair ramps if it's a choice to not be able to walk? Should we as a society impose on everyone else the obligation to enable, right? Well, it's not necessarily a huge burden given that we're already carrying it, but the question is, should we have to? I mean, at what point does societal interest get weighed, right?
This is something we were talking about earlier. The idea of choice versus kind of inherent natural conditions, right? In many social contexts, it's easier to argue for disability if it's a natural thing that people have no choice in, right? You're in a wheelchair and that's just something that happened to you. If it becomes framed as a question of choice, if we sort of abolish the normality of certain bodies and all types of bodies, all morphology is simply choice, then you still have to find a way, a moral framework that then allows for things like the Disability Act.
Well,
I think Sandberg.
Sorry.
Which I think Sandberg does. I'm agreeing. But
I think he kind of treats morphological freedom, I think, as a solution to that. So that, hey, there is a societal cost to these. So we want to create something like morphological freedom and enshrine it as a right so that you do...
yes, that's basically it.
So you are mandating then that we have to provide those things ethically because of morphological freedom, even if it is a choice to have such a body.
I mean, I think another example which might be a bit might actually be kind of clarify this, because the one thing I am worried about is I don't think, is anyone here deaf? Don't have to put out your hand if you're not. But here's one that actually I think is a bit close to home. What about how much? Because this is a big thing in the UK. How much should public services rely on the people using them having the internet? Right, because that's as close as you get to enhancement these days, right? Just because your iPhone or whatever is external to you, it's still to a certain extent an AR device, right? So to what extent do we actually allow people who don't have the internet to, still access public services? To what extent should we, make it so that those people who don't have the internet can still, easily phone up or send things in through the mail or whatever? And do we have to keep telling them you can access this through the internet? Because that can be really annoying if you don't have it and you don't want to use the internet.
Or suppose here's a hypothetical. In the future, we have a genetic treatment that essentially boosts the immune system and renders you immune to disease. Maybe it's fantastical, but that's not the point. Suppose that we have that, and you can give that to your children relatively cheaply. It's easily available. Everybody can get it at birth. Do we then have an obligation to continue producing vaccines for people who choose not to get it? In some ways, you could argue that's like producing ASL interpreters, right? That we are essentially taking people who do not have something that everybody else has and providing them with an uplift. But it would be extremely expensive to do. Do we still have to do it? Is that an obligation of the right of morphological freedom? What if everybody has wings except for some people, and so a bunch of people want to build buildings that don't have elevators, right? Do we now obligate them all to produce elevators on the grounds that there are some people who don't have wings? I think you can sort of generate an enormous number of hypotheticals, and Ismail has a I think that's a great example as well, right? Banks are shutting down teller services. They're much more hostile because they've got other services that they want people to use. What extent we expect the public to bear the burden of people's choices in how they interact with each other is really a question I don't think Sandberg talks about. Like, he acknowledges that it's an issue, right? But
The thing
I
is,
don't
it
feel
does
like
feel-
that's addressed.
I do feel like it's an issue that really needs to be addressed at length, because, like, I don't necessarily take the negative position from Sandberg to a certain extent. Like, I do actually think it's a bit like I'm a trans woman. I certainly do not think that people should be allowed to dictate what my body is like, because, like, to a certain extent, this is actually one of my frustrations with Sandberg's paper, is that I kind of feel like we actually do need to talk about the right to morphological freedom, because, like, a lot of people are actually in the crosshairs, like, in the crosshairs of, like, lack of morphological freedom. So I think that, to a certain extent, I think we do need an analysis on this, but I'm not really sure that Sandberg, yeah.
It's a pretty early work. It's from 2001, so 20 years ago about.
Yeah, I do think we need, like, I do think we need a sort of better Sandberg. It's just, I don't really think that Sandberg quite, really addresses it.
There's another kind of issue with, I think trans issues are a great example here. A conception of morphological freedom like Sandberg's that kind of shoves aside mental health as an exception ends up as a huge problem, because you'll just see a moralistic society that will shove any exercise of morphological freedom it doesn't like into a mental health issue.
It reminds me of arguments about free speech, right? A lot of people talk about free speech, but then they also have these other little cubby holes. Well, that's not free speech, that's slander, that's blackmail, that's threats, etc.
Right.
Well, I mean,
that gets back to the framing it as a negative right. You define the general right, and then you cut out these little cubby holes.
And when these cubby holes are, like, clearly delineated, I think that's not necessarily automatically a problem. So, like, if you have an idea of incitement, topical, but if you have an idea of incitement and it's a very specific idea of incitement, you can make a pretty meaningful exception there, potentially. But with something like mental health, where a lot of our health is social, what's to say that, like, hey, I'm just going to define you being trans or me being trans as a mental health thing? And now now obviously you don't have morphological freedom there, because, hey, it's just a mental illness, and you don't have morphological freedom in those cases.
And I mean, it seems like. Sorry, do you want to go, Vin?
I was just going to say that seems like a good leading off point into
Yeah.
the third work. My words to Victor Frankenstein, which is very much the trans perspective on morphological freedom in some ways, to contrast to Sandberg's, I guess, naive disability framework. Or naive disability rights framework.
Yeah.
Because so one point that is made in the basic course of the paper is that trans bodies and trans minds are both considered very suspect by a society that does not really care for them. So you've got the example of that one poor trans girl who was basically bullied to death by the queer community. And was it Seattle or Portland?
Seattle.
Seattle, right. Basically bullied to death by the queer community of Seattle. And who the queer community of Seattle then said, Well, why didn't they get therapy for their issues? Why didn't they seek counseling after they had themselves gone out of their way to put her basically in the place where she did that?
Yeah.
And so I do think that sort of highlights a way in which both trans bodies and identities are considered suspect. That's the grounds on which she was basically bullied to death. But also, their minds are considered suspect because the response was, well, clearly she was just having mental health problems. There's no societal issue at hand here.
I mean, to a certain extent, I think this is kind of endemic with. I mean, this is a thing that actually was, I think, is fascinating, contrasting like the Yudowski paper with strikers, right? Sorry, many people with S. Which is that the thing is like the thing with Yudowski, or I cannot say that name, goddamn. But the thing with him is that he doesn't seem to realize that people might want things other than, I can't remember how Stryker put it, but like the perfect vision of like cishet medicalism. Like she actually directly kind of addresses him across the years into the future in her paper, saying, you are transformed by you have transformed me as part of your quest for this sort of like beige immortality of medical science, and yet you can, like, by my very existence to a certain extent invalidates you because you are like, I am a rejection of the things that you think are important, like like a fixed sex, like masculinity. Like I am a rejection of that, and by my very existence, which you made, I also destroy you, because you can't, like, how does society, and I think this is one of the reasons why people find trans people so threatening in a way. How does a society maintain this vision of normality when the basic categories of it are suddenly brought into question in that way?
So I think I actually found the quote there, and it's interesting. You don't see this a lot in trans perspectives anymore, I guess. But it explicitly calls out medical science, doctors, and a lot of early trans surgeries as effectively ways to renormalize trans people, because they were. That was, the whole gatekeeping thing. Here's people who can be fit back into the natural order, and these are techniques that exist to save them and fit them back into the natural order. So it's a sort of call to reclaim those things, but it does not really accept that those intentions were ever good, or that we should, praise the medical science that brought this, which is where the key part of the whole Frankenstein's monster thing comes in, right? Dr. Frankenstein is not any better just because the monster is good.
Well, I think this is an interesting perspective when you're talking about the natural order.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, this might not be Yudowski and more the people who followed after him, but as someone who is sort of adjacent to the rationalist project, I've always found the most interesting thing is the whole dismissal by them of what's natural being inherently good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess we can bring this back to the so there's a line in the Xenofeminist Manifesto about the shrine under nature's tomb has cracked, due to the possibility of transition. I think that's pretty insightful as to what Shadell was just saying with regards to like the reason people find trans folks in general just sort of threatening is because they undermine this idea of the natural. And once you've started undermining the idea of the natural, I mean, that just sort of continued on for a while. You can't really undo that meaningfully. Like, the Nazis tried. You know, that very famous Nazi book burning? Um, the books they burned were the library of the Institute for Sexualwissenschaft, I think. I'm not sure if I pronounced that quite correctly, but it was an institution studying trans people, essentially. And they were basically the earliest place to do research into, if I remember correctly, not only hormone replacement surgery, but also like surgical assistance for trans people. And they had basically all the records, all the information, all the science was collected there. And that's part of the reason why folks say, well, you don't have a history. This is a new thing. You can't find any records that go before the 1950s, is because those records were all burned. They were destroyed. And yet the possibility is still there. It's not really gone. And so even the attempt to destroy it didn't really do anything long term. Yeah. So I'm not sure to what extent we can really say that there is even a possibility of restoring nature at this point.
Well, I think that restoring nature it's a bit of a very tricky framing because it requires defining what nature is. And a lot of the social movements that proudly proclaim themselves to be guardians of nature actually don't have a very cohesive framework on what's natural, what is unnatural, what's unnatural, and what the boundary between these states are. Like
Well, I think
one of the things that I'm sort of, I don't know, sympathetic with Sandberg is that at least he isn't, trotting nature as in his arguments, because nature is what you make of it ultimately.
yeah, and I think that's also a point that's made by the Xenofeminist Manifesto.
Yeah, I think that's really the central point of it.
Yeah, a lot of these arguments from nature are not really coherent arguments. They are signaling
Thought terminating crusade.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thought terminating cliches is a good way of putting it. Seems like we got a lot of folks going to dinner. I guess the European crowd.
I'm gonna have to vanish in a sec, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And
Do we want to like declare an intermission?
Well, we could, or we could try to wrap things up a little quicker than last time, because I think last time we went for 2.5 hours, and
Okay.
we've been going for about an hour and a half now.
Yeah.
Sure.
I did actually have some points. The original points I suggested these three essays together for. I do want to bring those up, but
Okay, yeah, we can do that. And I did have a thought of a subject, which was basically, so looking at all of these, can we compare them to like the cyborg myth brought up in the Cyborg Manifesto and say, okay, well, I feel like Sandberg and Yudkowsky are doing the thing where they try to reify humanism as the central point, whereas Stryker does a lot more in the realm of the like cyborg theorist, where she's creating a new potential futurity through the frame of the Frankenstein's monster. But I don't know to what extent that's a fertile ground for discussion. So go ahead and start with yours.
Okay. So like the original reason I brought up these three essays is that they all feature something very interesting. I think Yudkowsky actually serves as a very sort of like unintentionally insightful case into sort of how transhumanism has been framed. It is very much a recuperation of the ideas set forth in the Cyborg Manifesto in terms of humanism. And he actually does raise real, genuine criticism of classical humanism. There's a whole lot of terminating cliches in there. Like the notion that old age, that's okay and natural and good when you die, but other things that kill you, those are bad.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I mean, we dismiss Yudkowsky a lot because he engages in his own brand of cliches.
Mm-hmm.
But he's very good at pointing out obvious cliches, which are generally so common, so rooted in our collective thought that they tend to be missed.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, his lack of grounding is freeing in a certain way.
Yeah. Transhumanism, in his mind, is simpler because it removes those special cases, those thought-terminating cliches, and says, well, why not keep doing it? Maybe there is a point where, because we're stepping in, from the human to post-human, that we need to be sure that we know what we do, but at the same time, because we don't know how this is going to be, we won't ever know until we try it. And while Yudkowsky very, very barely touches on that sort of note, I do feel like he does there are some substantive criticisms embedded in his work that can be extracted of humanism, like all those cliches. But he doesn't go far enough, and he's too wedded to other parts of, thought-terminating cliches of society, too grounded in society as it is, to question those status quos that Stryker, in her nature, does not. She provides a sort of antithesis to Yudkowsky's thesis of transhumanism. She says, we are already being denied our humanity. Why should we, those on the outside, those who have been forced to reconcile our inhumanity, be forced to return to the human, knowing that these assholes are going to throw us out, or the next people down the line, or the next?
Mm-hmm.
Why should we conform to them? And that is very much a foundational thought of inhumanism, and reflects back to a lot of the criticisms that I suspect that anarcho-transhumanism sort of is framed around to distinguish itself from, democratic, not less democratic, but libertarian transhumanism. Instead of having this naive notion that everything will sort of work out as long as we suppose these basic rights the way Sandberg does, they kind of confront those societal cliches. Well, why should we even consider property a thing? Or if we do consider it, where are our limits? Is it private property, personal property, public property? What is okay, what is not? They question those things.
Well, is Sandberg even really addressing this? Because he doesn't seem to. And I don't think that's necessarily a fault, because what he's trying to do in raising the bar on rights, on what human rights are, is basically expanding on the relatively unquestioned humanist framework. And the fact of the matter is that the humanist framework hasn't exactly been, universally respected, because we still have racism, we still have sexism, we still haven't fixed, or we still haven't reached a humanist utopia.
Well, that's kind of the thing that.
So I don't think that adding some more rights on top of it's necessarily going to disrupt the current lack of respect for humanist rights.
That's the thing that kind of Stryker calls out, is that the problem with human rights, of humanist thought, is that human itself is fluid and defined by the people who are at the top, and thus they have the right to exclude whoever the fuck they want.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like, I think to a certain extent that's kind of going back to the 90s a bit. Like, I wonder if at some point we shouldn't, like, maybe if we ever do a fiction one of these, we shouldn't, like, have, I don't know where you would find a PDF copy of it without piracy, but, like, if we could get, like, GURPS Transhuman Space versus Accelerando and something else on the reading list, I think it would be kind of interesting, because
we already have
like,
in Eclipse Phase.
Yeah, I mean, I think Eclipse Phase versus GURPS Transhuman Space is really interesting, because even like they're kind of like GURPS Transhuman Space is very much the end of history, right? Like it's really end of history.
Oh,
like it's in fact the most end of history-ish fiction I think I've ever read. To the point where it was actually almost impossible to game it because there really wasn't anything to do. But the thing with what I think is so interesting about both Sandberg and to a certain extent Yudkowsky is both of them come from that kind of mid 2000s cishet like milieu, and that to me seems like it's pretty like. I think that's kind of one of the reasons why there is this kind of poverty to their expressions, in that they don't really like. There just wasn't any like. There just wasn't any public debate on like humanism at that point, right? Like you look, unless you were actually in like the queer community at that point, and even if you were to a certain extent, like the idea that you might debate humanism, like the idea that you might want to go to something else but rights-based, like humanistic morality, would have seemed very strange to people. Like like that's not how we do it. Like neoliberalism, and it's all worked, whereas now when you basically have seen that framework, I mean, let's be real here, basically fail, right? Like like we've seen it fail in foreign policy, we've seen it fail in economic policy, and now we're seeing it fail in health policy. Well, that suddenly seems very naive. I also need to go.
Question how much it worked in the first place, because we have a very, very short amount of, let's say, prosperity time, after the fall of the USSR. But frankly, a decade, it's basically nothing on a historical scale. So, if you take a decade and then you extrapolate it to the end of history, then you're going to end up with some very bizarre distortions, especially if you extrapolate a decade from an American and Western European perspective, like strictly from that perspective, because
yeah, I think the
numbers were going up there, but they're not going up uniformly. For example, 2010, when you had 9/11 and the crash in 2008, China was doing quite well. It was getting people out of poverty. So it's really a matter of perspective.
I think it's also something that the average citizen in the USSR or former USSR would question, given the actual tangible results of shock therapy on their lives.
Shock therapy, yeah, that was basically flat out murder.
I mean,
Basically,
that goes back to a chat I had maybe an hour ago about end of history. Someone living there, and they also said directly that they don't understand how somebody could think that there is an end.
To a certain extent, it was the same bad policy of the 1980s, just with less to restrict it from being implemented.
it's almost reminiscent of the Pinochet regime to me, in that you basically had these Western theorists and their assumptions go into country, and they implemented liberal market values and without any restrictions that existed in the Western market. And this caused basically mass atrocity, a lot of deaths, a lot of harm to people that didn't need to happen at all. But it's treated as like a good because, well, the numbers went up.
Well,
Yeah.
I think the fact of the matter is that a lot of theorists don't really understand how complex and interconnected society is. And when you look at it from a single metric, like the stock market, or I don't know, getting people out of poverty even. Like, what does poverty mean? What does getting people out of poverty mean? Because you have to very much look at society as a whole. You can have explosive growth in one part of the country and have a genocide in another part of the country, which has happened in Africa a couple of times in the past 50 years or so. So it isn't really something that's going to be so easy and so uniform. So you can just say, well, we put the democracy there or we put free market there, and then everything is going to be all right. And in relation to transhumanism, this means that changes aren't going to be linear. There's going to be a lot of unpredictable effects. And whilst I do think that these effects are going to be positive largely, they really need to be, I don't know, planned out in a certain way, or at least considered.
Um, Go ahead, Maeve. If you have an answer to that.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't saying anything.
Okay. Well, yeah, because I don't actually have a direct response to that. I'd just like to go ahead and finish up sort of what I was saying, because we dug really deep before I had a chance to actually ever finish. Like the idea of Yudkowsky sort of as a not really the thesis, but a prototypical thesis of transhumanism, and Susan Stryker as antithesis. I do feel that there's a lot of room for a post-humanist philosophy to be extracted when you look at it in terms of Stryker's criticisms and Yudkowsky's criticisms. That maybe we should get rid of these special exceptions built within humanism. Maybe we should further, get at that core issue that it's framed entirely around humans, and what human is entirely limiting. Like, what about non-humans who could potentially be just as smart as us, like dolphins and apes and so on and so forth. I mean, even dogs evident signs of sentience. And
If we're going to, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
go ahead.
If we're going to talk about specifically the interaction between, the internet rationalists and trans issues, it might be a good idea to talk about Scott Alexander's very famous post about how the categories are made for the man.
Well, yeah, that's essentially what she's saying. Categories are made for the white cishet man, well-to-do, and an owner of property. And anything outside of that has been extrapolated. It's been us making making fewer exceptions than existed in the original work.
I don't think it's necessarily been, I don't know, extrapolated, but I do think that there has been a sort of an expansion of rights based on a certain framework. Like you have rich landowners who happen to be white and Christians and cis and etc. And then you have an outwards expansion of rights to all the other peripheral groups, or peripheral, because if you add them together, they're more society. Actually, because you have women, you have black people, you have natives, you have etc. 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 You have all these other categories, and they sort of get brought into the framework very slowly and very painfully. And that's progress in a sense, but it's also very binding to that framework, because you start with the framework which is built for these rich landowners, and then you have the idea that everybody has to be like them, or has to at least approach that arbitrary standard to be considered, I don't know, valid, successful, real in a way.
Yeah. Anyway, we're getting pretty close to the 2-hour mark. I know we had a slightly late start, so it's actually more like hour and 45 minutes. But it seems like we've had a couple of people drop off again. And so I figure before we call a close, we ought to, I don't know, are there any like final remarks people want to make? And also, do we have any suggestions on next week's reading so that we can get that settled now rather than having to have a discussion tomorrow about it?
You should probably come up with like a topic for next week or something to link together some readings. I don't know what that would necessarily want to be. There is the Bradshaw paper there, which is good. And I think if you did kind of want to go into disability, or at least sort of talk a little bit more about that in that context, I would probably try and find a copy of the Shipu Sang, which I think is really good and is a fairly quick read.
Okay.
Maybe a third one. Maybe a third one that comes at it from sort of a different direction. And I'm sort of glancing through my shelves at this point to see if I can come up with something along those lines.
Another school of transhumanism? Okay, so I think we've broadly gone over the sort of cyber feminist transhumanism in the last one, and the sort of more generic transhumanism, both in this one and the last one, through first the Transhumanist Manifesto, and this time through Yudkowsky and Sandberg. And today we were introduced to a sort of feminist, inhumanist perspective, which isn't really cyber feminist per se, but which has a lot of parallel themes. So, what would the other categories be, do you think, AI? Because someone was suggesting other schools.
Well, there's the cyber feminist school, which I would argue there's the inhumanist school as well, although it's not strictly transhumanist. It covers a lot of the same ideas.
It's
And
a post-humanities sort of deal.
yeah, it's a post-humanist school. Post-humanist as in like a postmodern modernist look at humanism. There's also the singularitarian and extropian schools, which are derived from libertarian transhumanism. Yudkowsky also counts as singularitarian school. Extropians, it's very much about, it very much frames things as sort of like defeating entropy. In its school of thought, it's very technology will give us all of our solutions. It would certainly be interesting to dive into. We have touched a little bit on anarcho-transhumanist thought, which is a synthesis of anarchism and transhumanism. We can definitely explore that more. There's also the Democratic school, Democratic transhumanist school. I linked. Oh yeah, Nick Land would be more NRX, which in many ways is its own school.
I guess that
but in many
depends.
ways not.
I'd say Nick Land's early work would probably lean more towards the inhumanist and cyber feminist, but his later work, post breakdown, would definitely be NRX, which I don't think we really want to do too much of that. I don't know if we'd want to have like a full meeting dedicated to tearing it apart without any alternate perspectives, so probably not that.
Yeah.
Are there any other like leftist transhumanisms? I think we mentioned Soviet transhumanism. Is there like a, I don't know, Maoist transhumanism? When I think Maoist, I think peasant rebellion, so I don't know that that would actually work together, though it might have takes that are oppositional to transhumanism that might be interesting.
Citizen Cyborg is a book, unfortunately, so it's a big honker. I don't have the only one, but that would basically be the Democratic transhumanist sort of thesis book. We can also delve into singularitarianism, with the singularity is near, and Werner Vinch's essay, Becoming Technological Singularity, How to Survive in the Post-Human Era, which would lead into theory fictions like Acceleranda, Glasshouse, Saturn's Children, and so on. But if we decide to go in a more leftist school of thought, there's also very interesting the book Posthumanism, which seems to be a textbook covering a whole covering the whole area of posthumanism, much as the book Transhumanism, linked earlier, kind of acts as a rich overview of the field. So yeah, there's a lot of choices to make.
Okay. Yeah, and that's just in like the let's look at another school of thought on the issue type deal. Does anyone see anything that interests them there? Because like it feels like it's just me and AI talking right now.
Well, I think that people are silent because they're down for pretty much anything.
Silence is essence. Not sure how comfortable I am with that assumption, but
Let's put some ideas in the links and meeting planning, and then people can skim or look at the titles, and we'll see if anyone thinks of anything after that.
Yeah. I would like to, at some point, diverge into, post-humanist ethics. If I can find the essays that the book Posthumanism is based off of, that would be excellent. But in the short term, the book is what we've got.
okay. I'd be tempted to say, let's look at something like, I got a book a while back that I haven't read all the way through, Fully Automated Luxury Communism. That might be an interesting look on a leftist take on transhumanism, but it didn't feel like it was very transhumanist, to be honest, which is interesting.
More about post-scarcity stuff, which is interesting. It'd be actually interesting to tie that with, Drexler's book. This Radical Abundance, certainly. But I'm thinking of the one that's easily accessed online. Engines Creation 2.0.
There's also the potential. I think, okay, Squishy, you were talking the other day about anti-morphological freedom takes.
Was.
Yeah.
Not immediately come to my mind, I'm afraid.
Do we have any? There's got to be better community or sociology-based takes on this. I feel like we're doing a lot of individual rights stuff.
Yeah, that's true, and I do think we should look more at the sort of collectivist take here and there, at least. But yeah, how that looks, what we would focus on is question that hasn't been answered yet, obviously. So I'm trying to think of any anti-morphological freedom works that we can contrast back against this week's reading. And the only one that I'm able to think of is a book which, from what I understand, Susan Stryker's essay we read this week is in some ways a response to gynecology, which is very trigger warning transphobia, because it is literally one of the very early TERF works, back when TERFs actually felt the need to ground themselves in feminist thought in a more meaningful way than they do now. Yeah. Eclipse Phase's Jovian Republic.
Who brought that up?
Ithalid in the text.
Oh, I see. Sort of as a more conservative yet progressive compared to today's society, sort of thing.
I wouldn't call the Jovians particularly progressive. They're very much they're very much a take on sort of the Bush era Republican.
Oh, very much so.
It's just that they're one of the people, they're really the people in Eclipse Phase that are anti-morphological freedom. The human body is somehow sacred and we need to respect that type of thing.
We could also just start going in on fiction readings, because I did I sort of did think we were going to do more fiction reading than we have so far, but I think it is important that we do establish like the theoretical basis that we would be looking at the fiction from. I'm not sure if we've done that thoroughly enough yet, or if we'd want to continue for at least a couple more meetings, looking at different theoretical perspectives to basically ground our readings of fictional works.
I'm I think that there's definitely a place for more theoretical readings, but I think like the readings that we've done now have really grounded us in this environment of sort of a transhumanism, or a sort of liberal progressive end of the transhumanist spectrum.
Yeah.
And I think that we can read some, and I think that we can read some of the works in that environment. I'm thinking things like Eclipse Phase, I'm thinking stuff like that anyway.
Yeah, so we've mostly read very queer, feminist, and Marxist transhumanisms, and we really haven't read the other end of the spectrum, and I'm not sure if I want us to, like, jump into the deep end with fucking Nick Land, late Land stuff, quite yet, or not, but...
I'd really rather not. I think it would be better to do some theory, do some fiction, and then go back to theory. So look at, so read some fiction and then look at Land, potentially Moldbug, that sort of end of things, and then, I don't know, some AdMech works, I guess. If there are any.
Interesting. But I would argue, for example, we want to save Accelerando and just like Eclipse Phase for after we start reading about the singularity. So, like, we might put, say, the singularity is near, and then next week the week after that do Accelerando. That said, I feel like if we want to do a theory fiction that that's grounded in more or less the sort of very today stuff we've done, words, Rainbow's End by Werner Vinge might be a good choice for that.
I've heard of that. I'm not actually familiar with what the work is, but I think it got, wasn't it referenced in Knives Out? Or I think of something else.
Might be something else. If we want to look at, for example, Xenogenesis, we could, study up on Afrofuturism and, well, actually, we've already covered, cyberfeminist, some of the cyberfeminist work, so, we've got that part of it covered.
Yeah, I guess I'm struggling because most of what I'm familiar with is cyberfeminism, and I'm trying to think of works that aren't in that milieu, and I'm coming up a bit blank. Do you want us to have a somewhat more rounded set of readings? I guess we could do like an anarcho-transhumanist work and try and find a collectivist transhumanist work to balance it against. See if those like disagree and if we can compare and contrast. But
almost everything I've seen thus far of anarcho-transhumanist stuff, just poking through, has largely been individualist. So if we wanted to do that perspective, we'd have to go back to, I think it was Emma Goldman who wrote those essays.
Wait, all the way back to Emma Goldman?
For to the statement of, you know, to have an individualist anarchism, you must have a collectivist anarchism first. Or not so much first, but as like, you must fight for collectivist anarchism as well.
Yeah. I'm familiar with Emma Goldman's arguments broadly. I've read some of her works, but
It's like Amartya Sen, right? Development is freedom. That's sort of her. Seems like her thesis as well.
yeah. My main thing is, while I'm sure anarcho-transhumanism pulls from anarchist thought, I'm not sure if we really want to like go into the like earlier anarchist thinkers that predate transhumanism pretty much entirely.
Yeah. Well, everything I've seen though seems to be very individualist. I mean, there's always more reading to do. I certainly haven't looked at the essays in the Anarcho-Transhumanist magazine that's in there. I've just sort of used it as an overview to extract topics from. Yeah, anarchotranshuman.org is the one.
I guess I can pull in, or try and pull in, a couple of other works from, okay, Afrofuturism, you said? I think I saw a couple of recommendations for Black accelerationist works that are sort of in that milieu.
Yeah. Oh, another good one in the reading recommendations is the biopunk essay. That might be good to go.
Biopunk?
Uh-huh. Biopunk, subverting biopolitics.
I mean, you could always find a copy of Fukuyama's book on posthumanism, in which he has an opinion on transhumanism.
Yeah,
he has an opinion on transhumanism.
He has thoughts. I'm not
which,
seeing
which FBH will despise, but maybe that's a good reason to read them. I don't know.
I'm not seeing it in the reading recommendations AI. Are you sure you added it there?
Oh, what, biopunk?
Yeah.
Damn it, I scrolled past it. It's in there. It's one of the links. One of the many links. Under essays is literally the first link. I'll throw it in meeting planning.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like that really does need something to go with it, but it'd be a good lead into stuff. Might be good to go with Afrofutures stuff in a lead up to Xenogenesis.
I'd be worried that if we want to go into biopolitics in any depth, we would need to read Foucault's works on biopolitics.
We could read Foucault. I think that Foucault's fine.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan.
I'm not sure to what extent this is like talking about biopolitics in the Foucauldian sense, or if it's talking about it in like a different sense.
Foucault might read better in French, but in all honesty, I really, really don't think he has much to offer.
Forgive me, I only know like a couple stereotypes, but does he have some sort of metaphor about prisons to bring up here?
Perhaps.
Well, we could read like The One-Dimensional Man. That's good. I'm a big fan of Mark Hughes, and he has a lot to offer, I think.
Okay, so
you're kind of getting like, you got to decide whether you're willing to sort of stray pretty far afield for that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like we should early on try to avoid straying far afield and sort of expand further and further as we go.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say biopunk subverting biopolitics as one of the works. It seems pretty short, no longer than the Xenofeminist Manifesto, probably about the same length. Possibly a bit shorter, actually. I'm not doing word counts, just looking at how long the article is. What would we want to do as like a contrasting perspective to that? Because we've got biopolitics, biopunk. And I guess this is a possibly sort of a lead into, okay, so biopunk seems to be looking at transhumanism from not just the mechanical perspective, but in the perspective of changing bodies, like biological transhumanism. So rather than cybernetics or peripheral electronics, it'd be something like adding or genetic modification, right?
Right.
Okay.
Well, I mean, it does include genetic modification, but
Yeah. So that makes me wonder whether we ought to contrast it to more technology-focused stuff, perhaps the grinder subculture.
sure, we could, bring in something on grinderism. Again, like if we want to just do a theory fiction, my recommendation for right now would be Rainbow's End, because it doesn't need much more grounding than what we've already done, because the rest of it is just sort of bush era politics extrapolated.
Mhm.
Okay, I think let's continue this discussion about what things to read in text chat. I'm gonna drop.
All right. Yeah. Let's call that it for today. Unless anyone has any like closing thoughts, I'll probably just cut out the conversation about stuff, about reading stuff
Yeah.
in post.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. All right, excellent.
Okay,
All
see you,
right.
everyone.
See y'all next week.
Bye.
All right. Now let me make Craig drop.
Yep.